Hi, this is Dr. Janice Makela. You're watching Questions and Answers with Dr. Janice Makela. Today, we got a lot of things we're going to be talking about. As you know, we talk about geriatrics and hospice, and of course, cannabis medicine, a very popular topic on the show. Um, so, we, um, in the geriatric world, one of the things that is happening is you may have seen in the news that the Supreme Court is taking up LGBT issues, specifically looking at the possibility of gay marriage. And as you know, many years ago, the Supreme Court upheld it and said that it needed to be federal. And so, thus, it was the law of the land. Since then, couples who wanted to spend time together, get married. And so a lot of the things that I used to see as a geriatric doctor before the advent of gay marriage, I really stopped seeing for some time. And I wanted to just again, and I know back, I think sometime in early June, may have told a few of these stories, may have talked about it. But with this becoming in the news cycle again, I wanted to just once again kind of talk a little bit about how this affects elderly patients because in the elderly population you have people who often cannot make decisions for themselves. They often are have difficulty making caring for themselves, and so they either need to live in a facility or they need to live with a loved one, or and sometimes they're extremely difficult decisions around the end of life, like when to withdraw care or when to seek more care, that type of thing. And these sorts of decisions need to involve the people who love you and care for you the most. Now, in most places, like in Illinois where I live, they actually have a sort of a scale of who is your decision maker. So if someone comes into the hospital and they're unconscious and they can't make their decisions, who do you call next? And the first person is the power of attorney. And it doesn't matter what else, if you have a power of attorney form, that first person is your power of attorney. Now, the second person after that would be your spouse. And so, and obviously, a lot of times people don't have power of attorneys. They say, no, 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 my spouse is my power of attorney. You know, so a power of attorney might be something where, let's say you don't have a spouse or you have several children or maybe your spouse has dementia. And so you have a form that says, my power of attorney is my spouse. Okay, no conflict there. Or you may say, unless my spouse can't make decisions, in which case then it goes to this child or this child. And a lot of times when it comes to children, in the next level on the state, again, in someone who doesn't have an advance directive or a power of attorney, a spouse is first decision maker. And be aware that people who are separated, if you're separated, technically, there have been situations where a spouse who has not been part of the family is legally married. I have run into situations where where they've said, no, no, the person living with them isn't their spouse, the person they're still married to, because sometimes people don't go through the whole trouble of getting a divorce, they just get separated. Um, so I've run into that situation. But so yes, spouse first, then either parents or children. And it's kind of the idea that if you're young, it's probably going to be your parents, and if you're older, it's going to be your children, right? And so either your parents or your children, and then it's more extended relatives, brothers, sisters, cousins, stuff like that at the next level, depending on the state, and then maybe friends or next. So, um, I once knew a lady years and years ago who was telling me that she had an aunt twice removed or something like that, but she was the literal last living next of kin, except for, well, actually, I think the gentleman who was, if I use that term loosely, who was caring for her and brought in on charges of abuse, wasn't actually a family member. It was a family member of the friend who had passed before her. Anyway, the story about that. So the state does have these kind of ways, but what that means is if you're like, nah, one, I want to pick a kid, or nah, I don't want any of my kids involved. They're all too emotional. I want my doctor or nurse nephew who really knows medicine and we have a tight relationship. You need to put that down. So that's what a power of attorney does. It lets people put that down. Now, uh, what happens is that a power of attorney is a legal document and it can be fought um, at times. I've had situations where, we've had power of attorneys and the family's like, no, 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 I have a different one, or the patient is demented already and someone's coming in and trying to get a new one signed, and you have to say, no, they can't sign the new one, that they already are unable to. You can't come in with a power of attorney form and literally take the person's hand and write for them. That's not how it works. It's the idea that when you have the ability, you make your wishes known. And so, and then one of the more interesting things I've seen about that was I years ago in residency, I had a lady, we talk about it with LGBT, but the LGBT groups are not the only people with atypical non-nuclear family setups. In fact, uh, you know, I had a lady who was a 95-year-old woman, no children, no family, and brought in by the paramedics, unconscious, and literally walks a troop of nuns walk in with the Mother Superior holding her power of attorney form, saying, "Hi, I'm her power of attorney." And I believe she was a retired nun, you know, and if she wasn't a fully retired nun, these nuns were her family. They were the only people looking after her and caring for her. They were making sure that she was well taken care of. And in fact, like I said, the Mother Superior had the power of attorney of healthcare. And so she was able to come in and say, this is what she wanted done, this is what she didn't want done. And so, it's not just LGBT people when we talk about atypical family structures, you know. And again, the thing in the state is really sort of based off of a typical, right? Wife or spouse, husband, then child or adult, then, so sort of more and more distant as you go down and finally ending with friend. Um, and some places don't even acknowledge friend or cousin. They just kind of stop. So that's where it's important. Now, years ago, I actually had a patient. And I told this story, but it's a good story. And it's also important to what we are talking about. But I had a patient in a nursing home, and she had dementia. No, she had a stroke. But before she had a stroke, she had a power of attorney form. And I laughed. I laughed to myself when I read this because it said in the power of attorney, in her advance directives, I do not want to go to Texas with my sister. And I'm like, that is the funniest thing I'd ever seen. I don't want to go to Texas with my sister until the sister from Texas showed up. I was on my way to the nursing home and I get a call from the nurse. And she said, the sister from Texas is here and wants to take her back to Texas. And I said, she wrote in her advance directives that she doesn't wanna go to Texas. The sister can't. And she's like, "Well, she's insisting that she's here with a notary public, and she's changing the advance directives." And I'm like, "I don't know if she can." And she's like, "You don't let her leave until I get there." And so I do a whole mini mental, and I talk with the patient, I talk with the family. I've spent a couple hours there, had this big meeting. Um, by the way, the patient was lesbian and had a partner for 15 years. And this was pre-gay marriage, and so they had the power of attorney form, and so now the sister's coming in and trying to get her own signed. And I did some mental status because she had a stroke, and it was clear that while the patient was talking and awake, that she also wasn't aware of really what was going on and was not decisional. And so I had this meeting, and I told the sister, I said, I'm sorry. I can have a more formal assessment. We can bring in a neuropsych doctor to do a much more formal assessment than the one I just did. But based on my stuff, she can't make a decision. The power of attorney form you're having her fill right now is invalid. And the one that she wrote that says she doesn't want to go with you is still the valid one. And the sister didn't take kindly to that and was starting to wheel her towards the door, and she's like, the patient was in a wheelchair, right? And started to wheel her towards well, we're leaving. And I'm like, I actually got in the door jamb, and I said, if you leave, you are not the power of attorney. You cannot make decisions for her. If you leave, I will call the cops and have you arrested for kidnapping. She got in a little bit of a huff and put the patient back in her room. Eventually, a judge did get involved. They ruled that the first power of attorney was accurate and this one wasn't. And the sister went back to Texas, and my patient, you know, continued to stay in in Chicago with her loved one. And that is a cautionary tale that these types of things, marriage allows for a lot more than just powers of attorney. And so, rights to visitation, rights of all sorts of things. And so, end of life, who can be with you, who can make decisions. Um, Years ago, Obama actually fixed it. It used to be only that first members of kin could visit in the hospital, and everyone else had to kind of go through them and stuff like that. Now people can identify who they want to visit. And Obama, again, kind of opened it to everyone. So if the person you wanted to visit was the mother superior of your local church, then that was okay. And if it was your partner, that was okay. So that was and he applied it to all health. So hospices all have to apply to that, nursing homes, hospitals, and I think anything that takes Medicare, if I remember it right. So that was good as a doctor. But, then there's things like inheritance laws and property laws and things like that. So if I will say that if the Supreme Court overturns gay marriage, not only should people be talking to their lawyers about property laws and inheritance and the stuff we think about, but make sure you talk about healthcare stuff. Make sure you're talking about who's taking care of you. Make sure you have a power of attorney. Make sure you have an advance directive. Make sure other people know, and make sure you have people who can stand up for you. Like I said, in this particular case, you know, God knows what would have happened if she'd shown up at any other day except for the day I happened to actually be heading out there. Right? And so that is a real story, right? Now, other things. Um, so yeah. And if you're an older person, the other thing we see sometimes is that there's an increased risk of abuse in the LGBT community. Sometimes it's because of stigma. A lot of times people are still hiding, though these days more and more people are coming out as the grandparents see that the grandkids are all out. A lot of the grandparents are starting to come out and admit that, yeah, and so there's a little bit more acceptance of that, but there's still a lot of times it's very culturally ingrained that, "Oh, I gotta keep this quiet." And so a lot of times when you get partner abuse, a lot of the older populations won't admit to it. And so just something to be aware of. Sometimes you get exploitation where caregivers who come into the house maybe find a stash of gay porn or find other evidence and then use that to blackmail. There were cases back in the day of elderly people being blackmailed by their caregivers, saying, "I'm going to tell your family, I'm going to tell your wife, I'm going to tell your grandkids and your kids." And so, yeah, it's a thing. Um, other things. So, other things in the news. As we know, there's still buzz about rescheduling cannabis. The We have not really heard too much. I was really hoping we might hear something like a much bigger update. Um, but, can the president just do it by himself? Well, no, though they did try putting a bill through the Senate or the House on Republican lawmakers trying to put some bill through on it. And that you know, the president having influence in both the House and the Senate might be able to get a law through. Then there's the other question about what's going on with the DEA. And we saw how much they slowed the wheels when Biden tried to do this. And there's a lot of talk, that the chief of the DEA is not a fan of cannabis. I mean, to be clear, when we're talking about this, you know, you have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, right? The FDA approves drugs. The FDA oversees like pharmacy scheduling and, the purity of your drug and all this stuff. Cannabis is scheduled under the DEA. So as we get that alphabet soup straight, a lot of times when I'm talking about a drug being FDA approved, it means it went through a bunch of trials and tests, and the FDA says it's safe, and the FDA says it's pure, and that it does what it does, and it's not going to hurt you, and it is going to help you, and here are the side effects, and here are the people who can help, and right. So the DEA works with drugs that are potentially abused. So the DEA is the Drug Enforcement Agency. So the DEA is really cops, right? These are the people who bust people for holding uh, cannabis and stuff like that. Yeah, right? Cannabis and other illegal drugs. These are the people who come in and like you have the big cartels and they break them up. The DEA is the one that is doing that, the Drug Enforcement Agency. So, as a doctor, the DEA says, okay, there are these drugs, they're kind of high risk for abuse. They could have a black market potential. They could, in the wrong hands, hurt people. Think of the opioids, right? Think of heroin, right? Stuff like that, where people can get really hurt. They can get addicted and overdose and die, and the fentanyl contaminating it can make it, right? That is what the DEA looks at. So they say, okay, well, there's these drugs. And then what they do is they say there's schedules. And so Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, Schedule 5. And Schedule 1 are things that are absolutely illegal. No medical use. We are going to come after you if you're using these, right? It is because they're the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency. Oh, but what they do is they give a doctor a license. And so as a doctor, I have to apply for my license. And in fact, I went for years not touched, even though I was like, I know a lot about cannabis. I could so talk and do this stuff. I was scared for years to do this because I'm like, oh, I do not want to do anything that gets the DEA coming after my license, right? I need that. I'm a hospice doctor because Schedule 2 are things that are high risk, but I have medical needs. And for me as a hospice doctor, number 2 is morphine. All my patients are going to need some sort of opiate, so dilaudid, morphine, all of those. And then number 3 on the schedule are things like Tylenol 3, codeine. A lot of the codeine things are in 3. And then you start getting down to like Ambien and Ativan, which again, a lot of hospice patients need. And then you get down, I think 5 is like Ambien actually is, I think 5, and Ativan, like lorazepam, the anxiety medicine, is 4, right? And so they give a license to me and all other doctors to say, yes, you can prescribe things between 2 and 5 because we're not worried that you're going to send this out to other people, and they can pull my license, right? If I get a if I write something, if I like work at an opiate mill and I'm like, okay, come here. Here's your fentanyl. Here's your fentanyl. Here's your fentanyl. Right? They're going to come after me and take away my DEA license. And as well, they should if I'm doing this and it's not in a hospice, you know. And there are people who actually do look at this. Years ago, you know, I actually did get called about that, a letter, but I was a hospice doctor. I was the person who was supposed to be. They said, "Oh, you're in the top 5% in the state of prescribers of opioids." I'm like, "I better be. I don't want to meet the person who's higher than me. Maybe an anesthesiologist, but yeah, right? Because every patient of mine is going to get some opioids at some point in hospice. Anyway, so what we have is there's a lot of people who have that. So that's kind of how the DEA works. So they can enforce it. They can take away the license of a doctor. They can arrest people. They can come after cartels and stuff like that, right? So the fact that the DEA is holding their hands a little bit and going, mm, mm, does not surprise me. That's their job. This is the background they're coming from. They see the worst, they see the bad things, they see the side effects, they see all the tragedies, and in their mind, they are trying to fight, the good fight against cartels and everything else. So, yeah, there's a lot of people in the DEA who are not going to be fans of cannabis. Um, and, if I had one thing to say to them, aside from please don't take away my license for talking about it, they're not going to do that. Like I said, not for talking about it. Um, if they could just see that cannabis is safer than morphine. Morphine is Schedule 2. It kills so many people every year with opioid overdoses. From oxy, even if you were to separate out the prescription opioids from like the heroin, and so many people die from the opioids. Yet we're able to understand that there are people in this world who need opioids to relieve their pain and suffering, that who need it at the end of life. You can understand that. You can see that. Why is it so hard to see that cannabis, which, yes, you have this group of people who are using it recreationally. You have this people, you even have the people who are abusing it in a way they probably shouldn't. Though people who overdose and overuse cannabis, aside from the few people who maybe die in a car crash or something like that, you don't have the massive amount of overdoses that you do, y- you know, tens of thousands of people die from opioids in a year or so, it's, whereas cannabis, it's not even close to that. So as far as safety, it's safer than opioids. Cocaine is Schedule 2. Cocaine will give people heart attacks. We have it Schedule 2 because there's a few very rare emergency situations where people need cocaine. One of them is severe nosebleeds. Marijuana should be appropriately scheduled according to its safety. And that would be arguably, I think 3 is even a little strong for it. 3 is where um, Tylenol 3 and Norco sit. And there are certainly still people who can overdose. And though, interestingly enough, if you overdose on Tylenol 3 or Norco, you're more likely to die from the Tylenol overdose because Tylenol will kill you higher than the amount of um, morphine in there or codeine, right? Now, but 3, at least it kind of belongs in there, Certainly, you might say 4 or 5, and, of course, the Americans for Safe Access say it should just be its own thing and call it 6, and just say cannabis just belongs here at 6. Create its own thing and its own rules and its own thing, 'cause, it's not like anything else. And that's that's kind of what's going on. And of course, there's a lot of big money involved. There's a lot of people who stand to lose money if they change it. There's a lot of people who stand to gain money if they change it to one way. A lot of people who stand to gain money if they change it to another way. So, sometimes the best we can just do is sit and pray that the right thing happens, right? That, because frankly, my hospice patients should be able to get cannabis at the end of life. Why is that so hard? Um, my cancer patients in palliative should be able to get it for their nausea. Why is that so hard? Why is that hard to understand? That our body has a system and that some people have a broken cannabinoid system. And the people who have a broken cannabinoid system respond to cannabis. You know, that's my 2 cents on that. No, again, if you guys, I'm here. If you got questions, if anyone wants to chime in, throw your questions up. I'm just talking in the meantime. Feel free to throw in any questions you got. Meanwhile, recent study on the brain. So I posted about a study on the brain recently. It was kind of interesting. Speaking of older people, and what this was in Europe. They did a big database of patients who had it was a database following healthcare outcomes. And so it started many years ago and it's been tracking people over this time and looking at, what are their lifestyles? What are they doing? What are they eating? What are they smoking? What are they, etc. And they took people who had cannabis and then people who didn't. And a subset of these people had taken a brain scan. They had done a very extensive functional brain scan. So it wasn't just a single MRI. of the brain. It was actually looking at it while it's working, and it was looking at the connections between the different parts of the brain, how the different parts of the brain talk to each other. And they were able to show that people who used cannabis, now, it was their definitions I quibble with a little bit, because it was people who use it once to 10 times. And so this was ever, no matter how remote. And I'm like, I'm really not sure if using it once when you were 18 is going to have these effects. So, or why it would have these effects, or, and hopefully you weren't using it when you were 18, but let's just say 30 for the case of sake of argument, you know, and and then so they had what they said, using it 1 to 10 times versus more than 10 times in your life, right? And so I'm like, so it's not looking at this person has dementia, now they used cannabis and, oh my gosh, cannabis cures dementia. No, that is not this study. It was a population study looking at people over the course of a lifetime and saying, have you used cannabis in your lifetime? How often? Did you use it more than 10 times or less than 10 times in your life? And then they said, and then they looked at these brain scans. And honestly, the way they were writing it, they were talking all about all the side effects and all this. It seemed to me like they were expecting to find, oh, and look, it causes brain damage too. No, what they found was they actually had improved function. So people who were just naturally aging, and they were looking at older populations, right? Af- they were looking as they naturally age, that these areas were thinning, that they were getting weaker, that these connections between brain areas were getting weaker. And in people who had used cannabis at some point in their life, they had stronger connections. And this was like a group of like 20,000 people they looked at. So it was not a small population. And and it held up it pretty decently in the statistics, right, to show that they actually had some better connections in their brain. Again, and then they went on a little bit to explain that these connection areas do have endocannabinoid receptors very strongly in them, and the areas that seem to respond most actually also had the greatest density of endocannabinoid receptors in these parts of the brain. And so their theory was that as you age, you start to lose the receptors, they become less functional. And so because they become less functional, people who maybe used cannabis, and again, it wasn't talking about people who are actively using, that's the only part that's a little bit confusing in this study. But their theory was that people who had used cannabis um, maybe we're supplementing that. And so it was slowing the decay of these areas and the breakdown. And they even did studies on cognition and memory and different aspects of thinking. And again, this was part of the regular study, but when they looked at people who had used cannabis versus people who had not, the people who used cannabis had higher cognitive scores. Again, kind of going to what they were saying. And, there's been a handful of studies here and there, and some were small in power. They said, yes, it helped protect the brain. Others were like, not really a lot of evidence. So this is notable for the sheer number of people involved in the study. And so that was really sort of an interesting thing. And so we found that. And but yeah, and then another question that this study doesn't answer is can dementia be prevented? And this was looking more at what they called normal aging. None of these patients were diagnosed with dementia per se. They were talking about normal aging, that a person, as they age, as they get older, as they start to lose these receptors. And so this isn't the same thing as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, where certain areas of the brain specifically start to break down more actively. Now, Parkinson's, there's some thought that the striatonagral area of the brain when it breaks down might be a little bit more sensitive to the endocannabinoid system and is tied to it. And that's why some people with Parkinson's actually may feel a little bit better because there is that sort of increased surge of dopamine that happens. Now, again, Parkinson's for Alzheimer's I'm sorry, my tongue tied. Cannabis for Parkinson's has not been approved or FDA approved yet. And I'd be hesitant, especially if someone's early and well controlled, to be suggesting that they use cannabis at that point because we don't know. One of the things that dopamine does is it wears off after time. And I don't know if adding cannabis would make it more likely to wear off sooner or so I'd be very hesitant about telling someone with well-controlled Parkinson's, yeah, you know, go use, don't, not yet, not yet, that one. Now, Alzheimer's, there's some question about using cannabis for Alzheimer's behaviors, and there's been a handful of small studies. There have been a really not great big studies out there yet, but there's a handful of studies that suggest that people with Alzheimer's, if you give it and small doses, I always suggest starting off with the smallest dose, like a quarter of a gummy and a milligram, and seeing how people react before you make sure they're okay with it, then go up and up and up slowly over the course of several days. You would increase the dose. So that is, but I keep always telling the story of an older patient who slept for a day and a half after taking God knows what dose. So you want to be careful and start very low. And then, speaking of legal issues, be careful to make sure that you're clear with the doctor what you're doing. So that you're not in a situation where someone's saying, "Oh, look, they gave mom cannabis," "Oh, that's abuse." So you want to make sure, but that is in dementia, it's on the table. Again, this is something you want to talk to the doctor about. Is this a situation that would be good? There's also some question that cannabis, again, higher doses of THC, might actually activate, block acetylcholine in certain parts of the brain, but it's not global, so maybe it doesn't quite cause delirium. But anytime you see acetylcholine blocked, famously in the drug Benadryl people use for sleeping, it can make delirium in some older people. It can make their transiently make them more confused. So again, reasons to go slow. Now, we are at around 7:40. Feel free again if anyone has questions. I'm here for them. This is Q&A with Dr. Makela. So, other things. Well, let's think. There is, hmm, yeah. Now, I think we've talked before about one reason some people who are older might take cannabis is topical. Topical, right? Is arthritis for pain, and a lot of times they'll use it topically. And I often recommend to definitely try that. And I've actually had a number of patients come to me and say, "Oh, I went to the yeah, I asked them what meds they were using, and they're like, "Oh, I went to the dispensary and I got some topical cream, and oh my gosh, it so helps. I haven't needed to use my pain medicine as much." I'm like, "Great. Hey." The thing about topicals, it doesn't cross the skin, and there's a difference. So there's transdermal and there's topical. And it's important you know the difference. If you go and you buy something and they say topical, it's not particularly the THC is not going to get into the skin, is not going to cross the skin and get into the blood. CBD might a little bit, um, but the topical is going to get into uh, is 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 going to stay on the skin. And you do have CB1 receptors and TRPV1 receptors on the skin. So it can help, just like lidocaine would help, just like icy hot or capsaicin cream. All of those work topically to help with pain. And so, in the same way, I think cannabis can. It also might block some of the feedback loops. Sometimes when you get inflammation on an area, like over a joint, there's a feedback loop where the pain actually causes the release of more inflammatory factors. So it's possible that working by the CB receptor, that might be decreasing that a little bit, um, because the CB, well, the endocannabinoid receptor does work on those particular nerves. So it's possible it could be having some nerve effect and some feedback, but it's not gonna soak into your joint. It's not going into the bones and muscles and joints. It's not gonna soak into there. Whereas cannabis, that's transdermal is going to go through, and usually what they do to make it transdermal is they add another chemical to it. They add a something that breaks the barrier of the skin down and makes it more permeable so that it can soak in. And if it gets into your blood, then you need to know, though, that you can get high. And so the reason someone might do a transdermal would be if someone can't swallow. Again, maybe at the end of life, we frequently will do transdermal medications. We do the transdermal fentanyl patch, right? I told you I've prescribed more fentanyl, right, than many doctors. And so the fentanyl is um, is right there. Is transdermal. It goes into through a patch. Now, there is, yeah. So it's important not to confuse it because one will help the pain, but it's just going to stay on the skin and won't get you high. The other will get you high. So just be aware of that. Um, Also, be aware that if you mix it with other arthritis creams, some of the arthritis creams, like the Voltaren, actually does have a thing to make the Voltaren soak through. So it's possible that a topical THC might soak through, and you might not be aware of how much can soak through. So you need to not mix it with other creams that might be have a little bit more of a transdermal effect. The we got a comment. Oh, thank you for the information. Oh, I'm glad you liked it. Happy. Thank you for commenting. Oh, from Jeanette. Hey, it's not showing up on the restream, but I see on LinkedIn. Thank you. So I'm glad you're enjoying it. Let me know if you have any questions, if you want anything for me to talk about specifically. The I usually prepare about 45 minutes of a lecture just in case people don't have questions. But I'm now I'm free for anything that you have to talk about. But meanwhile, yeah, the other things that are coming up. I know in October there will be a big conference of cannabis doctors that will be taking place in Denver. So I'm not sure if I'll be going there, if I'll be doing it remotely yet, but that's always exciting. There's to try to learn new things and new exciting things about cannabis. Every day it's like, oh my gosh, something new. There's so many, the endocannabinoid system. It I guess it's now kind of a long time ago because I'm aging myself, but the endocannabinoid system was only discovered in like 88, 89, and really had heavy research done through the 90s was when they sort of identified anandamide, the first endocannabinoid. And over the years, we find that it's actually the missing link between a lot of our health issues. You know, we talk about cannabis, but really, cannabis is just one little part of it. Fatty acids, the food we eat, the olive oil, the seed oils, the um, flax seeds, right? All of these things are all part of the endocannabinoid system. So that is a important thing. Oh, yeah. Hey, Olga. It is recorded. You'll be able to see it on YouTube and you'll be able to see it on LinkedIn, both of them. Um, the YouTube channel is under my name of Janice Makela, MD. It's also on a Twitch. I don't know. Twitch is an app mostly for video gamers. I don't know if there's a lot of video gamers who, but Twitch also is Canna friendly, so I stream on there. But yeah, Twitch, YouTube, and here on LinkedIn. And it will be recorded. You can find it on my page on either of those. And then the yeah, and feel free to chime in with any questions you might have. Like I said, this is Q&A, so I always tell people, you guys are the co-host. A lot of times when we get podcasts, right? You have one person and then today's guest is such and such. No, today's guest is you guys. You guys are always the co-host, is what I say. It's always the chat, as the kids say. Oh, Addison, thank you. Yes, you can. Please do. Um, she runs the Women's Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. So that's an organization that supports women in the cannabis industry so it just doesn't become an all boys club, right? So, yes, Addison, feel free to repost. The And like I said, again, I'm here for your questions. We still have about 10 minutes, so plenty of time if someone wants to throw in something else. Trying to think. One of the things that we hear a lot about in the cannabis stuff, but we don't hear a lot in the medical world are the terpenes. Today, I saw on LinkedIn my colleague Cody, who is a PharmD who does a lot of research about the endocannabinoid and about cannabis. He does a whole thing about educating people. And he had a whole wheel of terpenes today. And I was looking through that. I was like, wow. Now I've read a lot about them, and I don't know if you've know what those are. Terpenes are the thing that gives cannabis its smell. And it's not just cannabis, it's anything, any natural thing that has a smell. So rosemary, the thing that gives rosemary its smell is pinene, and another one, there's a handful of them, right? Things that make pine trees smell. So anytime you have a really fragrant, my marigolds, for that matter, i- that I grow in my garden are extremely pungent, and that's part of the reason they keep other bugs away from my plants, which is why I grow marigolds, right? Um, but these really strong, pungent herbal things are all terpenes. And even before cannabis, there's been studies because a lot of these are in your traditional healthy herbs. So when you think of limonene, I think, is no shock, something that's in citrus, right? Pinene, no shock, is in pinene. Yeah, is pinene is in pine trees, and rosemary and very herbally things in that sort of family. And the and so there's been studies already in the herbal world on some of these. So we already know that there's some medical benefit, but and it's hard to say, every people talk that, oh, a lot of times it's the smoking, right? And we know that a lot of the terpenes stay intact when people inhale or smoke or use the vaporizers. And so they get the medical effect. And they say that that's why, different strains, it's the terpenes. It's the specific blends of the different cannabinoids, but also the terpenes, that this terpene does this and this terpene does that. And I was thinking about it the other day, and it was like, with Schedule 3, that's actually going to be one of the things that we really are going to kind of miss. Is I don't see a world where big pharma is going to be going out and saying, okay, you know what? We have tincture A here, and it has this terpene and this blend of cannabinoids from this particular strain, and tincture B, because I was talking, I think it was the Charlotte's Web people when I saw them at Benzinga, we're talking about the difficulty of having to get FDA approval and showing every single little cannabinoid that was above a certain level in there, um, and then showing the safety and proof that this was good and this was good, and just the sheer amount of work it takes. So to do that, and then to also add in all the different terpenes and maybe have a nice little terpene palette, I don't think that's going to happen. It- So, which is a shame because it was interesting to see that while some of it is animal studies still, some of the terpene stuff is a little hypothetical based off of animal studies. Like pinene, that one struck me because they actually did some studies on, I think, rosemary extracted pinene, where it showed they actually did like pictures. They had volunteers that willingly took burn injuries to their skin and then let them heal. And one was a pinene, one was just the stuff that the pinene was in the base, and then one was nothing. And showed that the pinene healed significantly faster in the study. It's like, so yeah, there's a lot of interesting things with that. But as we reschedule, we'll see. We'll see if it becomes Schedule 3, Schedule 6, or if it just stays the way it's been. Um, I personally say if I had 30 minutes with some of these people, I'm convinced it could say the right thing. Assuming they've not already paid $1 million by someone. That unfortunate reality of our political world is that money talks the loudest, and so. But if that wasn't the case, if someone has money, um, if someone's mind could be changed, I think if they knew that the endocannabinoid system was real, that there really is a system in our body, you know, and that cannabis is more than just getting high. And the endocannabinoid system exists more than just getting people high. But the endocannabinoid system balances our body and helps regulate a lot of our systems. And that the number one medicine that's used for pain for that uses the endocannabinoid system is Tylenol, acetaminophen, right? And the number one consumed substances that affect the endocannabinoid system and activate it extensively are the oils that we eat, the fatty oils, the olive oil, the seed oil, the fish oil, right? And the number one thing for health we probably can do is the fish oil and omega-3 oils. So the hemp seed, the um, flax seed, fish oils, anything that has omega-3 in it is going to be calming an overactive endocannabinoid system, and it'll be healthier for you. And there's really good data that doing that, it's the Mediterranean diet basically, right? Or the DASH diet or the MIND diet. All of these really healthy diets all have this in common, where the things you're doing are actually balancing your endocannabinoid system in a positive way. Olive oil, avocado oil, balance it in a positive way. Seed oils, they get a little vilified. I have a gripe with the people who say seed oils are evil, so let's eat beef tallow. I'm like, you just went no, you went in the wrong way here. Seed oils do probably we know they become endocannabinoids. We know they can upregulate our endocannabis system. And perhaps if we eat them in the amount that our American diet is letting us, our endocannabinoid system might be over revved. And I've talked to someone who was explaining to me in their research, they were looking at the endocannabinoid receptors on the heart and showing that, yeah, in people who have an overactive endocannabinoid system, they have more endocannabinoid receptors on their heart, and that might be part of what's leading to heart disease. Um, that's one of his theories. He's the researcher trying to research it. He doesn't have it all yet, but as more and more data comes out, we're finding the food we eat is much more of an effect than the cannabis that people smoke. But on the other hand, you have people with broken, and I will probably say this and repeat this in tedium. There are people with broken endocannabinoid systems who, because it's broken, need more. We give dopamine to people who have Parkinson's because the dopamine regions of the brain are broken, and we give them. We give people with Alzheimer's a drug to help increase the amount of acetylcholine because people with Alzheimer's have broken parts in their brain that don't work with acetylcholine as well. They don't make as much, so you need something to help save it. Why is it so hard to understand that there are people with broken endocannabinoid receptors that need cannabis to replace the fact that they don't have enough endocannabinoids in these areas? So people with MS and, there's some thought that Huntington's might be another one that responds. We know certain people with seizure disorders, though that actually might be a little bit different. That might be a little more CBD based, right? But Huntington's, um, MS, definitely. And what was that? And then migraines. There's some thought that migraines and fibromyalgia, these chronic pain syndromes that people have, that these might be part of it. Why is that so hard for people to understand? Anyway, thank you guys for joining us. Look forward to just so you know, next week, I think I've been getting a little bit too split with people when I've been doing it twice a week. I don't think it's been very helpful. So I have decided to do Thursday evening. I just think there's more people will be available. Again, a lot of people can't talk during the working hours. So I think more people will be available Thursday at 7 Central Time. I apologize to any of my friends who might be in Europe who might have been able to make the 3 o'clock, who can't make a 7 o'clock. But I'm going to not do the Wednesday anymore. I will just be doing the Thursday. It's just a little too much in a week. So I appreciate your understanding on that. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing everyone next week. Y'all have a great day. Take care.